another world, another time, in the age of wonder.
You are listening to The Gathering Songs, the Dark Crystal Discussions.
The story runs deeper than you know, and you are part of it.
And what are those funny marks?
This is all writing.
What's writing?
Words that stay. When single shines the triple sun.
What was sundered and undone shall be whole, the two made one.
And here's your host, Philip Mitchell. Hello and welcome to The Gathering Songs. This is episode 21 of the podcast, and it's the first episode that we're going to do this as a video, if all works well. So I just want to thank you all for joining in, and as we continue and as we're going to discuss about the new comic book series from Archaea, Boom Studios, called Beneath the Dark Crystal. Issue 1 just came out on July the 4th. And, you know, for a lot of us, this was really exciting. Yes, everyone's got their covers. I got the cover on me. I should have brought it with me as well. Silly me. But yeah, I mean, I got the Doug Peterson cover, Doug, and yeah, that was one of my favorites, which was really cool. So we're going to chat about the first issue, and we'll see how we go. So to introduce everyone, I just want to we'll go first to Nancy Gray. Nancy, who is the author of the Blood Rain sort of saga films, and was an entry in the Dark Crystal Author Quest many years ago. So I just want to say, Nancy, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me again. Great to be here.
No worries, Nancy. And our next guest, we have Doug Fisher, though here on the show, he's known as The Fish. So, Fish, thank you for being on the show.
Always a pleasure. Thank you, man.
Yeah, and of course, we've got Peter M., the author, from, I know there are these books that you've been writing at the moment, and it just forgotten what it was called. What was it called again, the books that you've currently working on?
I'm writing the Dwim Saga.
Dwim
it's a
Saga.
sci-fi trilogy.
Yes, the sci-fi trilogy, yes. So with the Dwim Saga. So thank you so much for Peter for being back on the show.
It's always great being here.
Excellent. And last but not least, we've also got Jason Delgado. Jason, did I pronounce your surname right? Because I know there's been a couple of times I think
did that time.
Yes.
The way you could technically pronounce it is Jason Delgado.
Yeah, Delgado.
Fancy.
On my Lord of the Rings is Delgado. I think that was one of the things. I think when I first chatted to you on the show, on Trial by Stone, I think they sort of popped up. So I just wanted to make sure that was all
It cracked me up. So
yeah.
It was all good.
So of course, Jason, he's been doing these YouTube videos called the Dark Crystal Conjunction, which is basically like a pretty much. There's a YouTube channel called Star Wars Explained, which is sort of every day that they post videos about Star Wars, him talking about what's been happening and stories in the books and comics, etc. So you're doing your own sort of Dark Crystal take on that, sort of as the inspiration. So I just want to say, Jason, thank you so much for being on the show.
Yep. Howdy, y'all. Long-time listener, first-time caller. Thanks for having me.
First time video caller as we're doing this for the very first time, and yeah, I mean, I'm hoping this all works really well. And this is something, you know, that we're going to look into for future sort of shows to make these sort of video shows, to put them on YouTube as well, as an alternative for our listeners and viewers as well on the YouTube to check it out. So, I guess, you know, let's start off. I mean, I think I'd have to admit, I don't know if you guys are, that I was really surprised when they first announced that they were going to do a follow-up sequel to The Power of the Dark Crystal called Beneath the Dark Crystal, which was announced, I think, like early this year, early 2018, that they announced that this is what they're going to go with. I really thought Power of the Dark Crystal was going to be sort of the last thing in the timeline, and for them to sort of focus on the past. I actually wanted to know, just sort of, you know, I guess we might as well chat about briefly just sort of our overall thoughts on Power the Dark Crystal, because I know I'm sort of skipping it over, for Beneath the Dark Crystal. So I might start with you, Jason. Just sort of your quick overall thoughts with Power the Dark Crystal before we delve deep into Beneath the Dark Crystal.
I was glad that Power of the Dark Crystal finally came out in some form. It was in production hell forever, bit trying to be a movie. I was glad that they did finish it. And you're right, too. I thought when issue 12 came out that it was done, it was over. We're going to spend more time in prequel-type era. But, yeah, it was very surprising to get that. I would definitely say for the listeners that before you jump into Beneath the Dark Crystal, you would want to read all the Power of the Dark Crystal. I think it assumes you should have read those. I overall enjoyed it. It was always an intriguing read, especially when you started getting to the last final months, kind of finding out what happens. A lot of really cool stuff, especially new worlds like Mithra. Like you never knew that existed before, and boom, there it was underneath. In that down that long fiery shaft the whole time.
Yeah.
So it definitely had some cool stuff. Had some great creatures. When I reread it, I enjoyed it more, especially after listening to the author and him explain some of the stuff. I still had the issue of like, oh, the Urskeks came back, or not the Urskeks, but the Skeksis came back, and the Uru. I still had that kind of issue, but when I gave it that second read through, I enjoyed it a lot more for what it was, and overall, I was positive. I'm always happy to get more Dark Crystal stuff.
Yes, yeah.
So.
Yeah, absolutely, and especially at this time now, with the comic and also, I mean, we're still getting J.M. Lee's sort of his next 2 books of that 4-book series that's going to come out, and then sort of, with Age of Resistance as well, just to top it all off. So a lot of Dark Crystal sort of happening, and now and into the future. That's for sure. Yeah. But yeah, like as for myself, like I was sort of. Like, reading it, I wasn't a huge fan of how sort of the Mystics and Skeksis came back. And it wasn't really till I chatted. And I think most of you probably agree that it seemed like, sort of thinking about, I can understand why they would do it in the movie or like in the story, because it's like, got to bring those characters back because that's all the characters we know and love sort of thing. So I can understand why, but I don't think it sort of... wasn't the best, I guess. I don't know, but after chatting with Philip Kennedy Johnson about it and sort of giving his own explanation of how they came back, sort of like how they sort of came back because they were those characters were so deeply connected to the crystal, so whatever happened to the crystal sort of affected them to then sort of come back to Thra. And so after that I was sort of like, okay, and then again, like I think like you said, Jason, when I read it for the second time, start to end, binge reading it. I definitely enjoyed it for what it is, and I mean, I like the characters, I like the world, I like the setting, but I think the story was, it was just okay. There wasn't much to it, but I guess yeah. I don't know if anyone else.
I think Nancy has some feelings on it.
Yeah.
God. I'm trying to be nice.
Yeah.
I am. I did not like it.
Yeah.
I have 2 pages of notes of why I didn't like it, and 1 page of notes, like a half a page of notes of what things I did like. Because I was like, I gotta be fair. There were things I liked about it, or else I wouldn't have gotten through it.
Yeah.
But the Skeksis and the Uru. Well, I didn't get that the Skeksis were like, they came out of the crystal, but the Uru were somehow still there. I was like, but they all merged together at the end of the film and became the Urskeks, and they went back to their own planet. Why are they here now? And it just, I felt like it would have been a stronger story if they had left them out. Because it's like, we would have these really deep scenes where, like, something was going wrong and the crystal was dimming, and, there was this blight on the land and all this really interesting stuff. And then suddenly the scenery-eating bad guy would be there, and I was like, no, just leave them out. It would have been a better story, in my opinion.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I tried to look at it in an open mind when I saw the cover, and it's like, okay, it's like, they look like Jin and Kira look evil, and
zombie looking.
This gig looks like something out of a nightmare, and I'm just sitting here looking at this going, I am not gonna like this book.
Yeah, it was
But-
such a very interesting cover that they sort of went with. But I think that's a great thing about Beneath the Dark Crystal. Probably one of the things I really enjoyed about it was I felt like it was a bit refreshing in a way that, we got no mystics and no Skeksis, so far into the story, I guess, Who knows, they could come back again. I certainly hope not. I really think the story for them in Power, I hope that is sort of the end of their story, in that timeline. Certainly looking forward to seeing them, in Age of Resistance and all the prequel stories. I think they're definitely well suited, to that era. But in regards to sort of the Power of the Dark, the Power of the Dark Crystal era, the Age of Power, I think it's, I'm really looking forward to reading, the rest of Beneath, just because, it sort of feels fresh and yeah, I mean, there was some stuff that definitely went down with Beneath the Dark Crystal. So yeah, I guess without further ado, we might as well get started with our discussion with Beneath the Dark Crystal. I guess, one of the things, with issue 1, I know it starts with the narrator tells a story about, the two worlds that sort of exist into one. So now we have Thra and Mithra that sort of exist now. This has always been very interesting that they've never sort of intertwined with each other, in the past. I think it was interesting how I think it said it was entering a new age yet to be determined. Though I think, Jason, I know at the end of issue 12, it was referring to it as the Age of Harmony. Am I right about that, Jason?
Yeah, which the first age, or one of the first ages, is also called the Age of Harmony.
Yes,
so I remember we were chatting. It's the Age of Harmony. Well, when I was writing it down in my notes, I call it the Age of Harmony / rebirth, because the crystal gets reborn.
Yeah.
And I think you had a good description for it as well.
Yes, I call it the second Age of Harmony. Sort of like, sort of the Lord of the Rings-y kind of thing,
Right,
you have first, second, third age, the second Age of Harmony. That's sort of my headcanon of, but who knows? I mean, because it's saying that it's a new age yet to be determined. But I think that's probably more about what the story yet to come in that regards. I know Ethan Erskar, who's part of the sort of the Dream Fasting, the Dark Crystal experience. I know he's posted his sort of commentary on the comics, which was a great read that I really liked. His thoughts, in that sort of with Beneath the Dark Crystal. Sorry, he mentions that. I think one of his first comments was like, but now in this new age, the crystal's light reaches beneath the Dark Crystal. And having read this comic several times now, I feel like this issue is implying that the crystals never touched Mithra until now. Like sharing the crystal's a new thing. The Power series suggested that there had always been a connection between worlds. It was just temporarily blocked. So I thought, that was sort of interesting. The fact, because they were both always connected, it probably wasn't until that 100-year gap in between the Dark Crystal and Power of the Dark Crystal that, things were starting to get a bit blocked, from both worlds. Yeah, and sort of going, moving forward to that, especially with the timeline, we've actually seen, like, the characters that we know from Power, they seem to have aged quite a bit, especially with Therma, which I think, is probably just one of those sort of representation. You could sort of take it as sort of like a representation of the art, because it's a different artist who's working on Beneath the Dark Crystal, Alexandria Huntington. Yeah. Huntington.
I kind of feel that's done purposefully, because he's thinking back on her in one of the other pictures, and she looks younger. And then when you actually get to her point of view and everything, she looks older, which I thought was actually really cool.
Yeah.
That was one of the things I liked about it. It's almost like, even if they're not older per se or much older, they've matured to such a way that they're portrayed more adult in this comic than they were in the original. In the Power, I mean.
Yeah.
Well, it's like they've been through something in Power, right? That had an effect on them, kind of that.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. Yeah. So yeah, that was one of those things where I was really interested to know, whether how much time has passed, and I like to me, because I think throughout the comic, I think it says it's pretty much happened sort of very soon after the events of Power, that that this story beneath sort of occurs. But yeah, my vote was just looking through my notes that it's a direct continuation, that art can be reinterpreted, and I think the following pages, as we get into it, I think the father character says that it was a short while. So yeah, and so we sort of get into we sort of see sort of the overall story of what's to come. And again, I think we did chat about. I know you mentioned about this, Jason, that this was a sequel to Beneath the Dark Crystal. I actually wanted to know with everyone your opinions. Maybe yourself, Peter. Just from a storytelling point of view, when you're telling a story that takes place, if you're writing like a second book, or if you're writing just a second story, or even in books that you probably read in general. Did you feel like Beneath did a good job of trying to sort of, let readers know like what happened in Beneath the Dark Crystal? Because I've read a lot of reviews from, particularly with the new readers, and they were sort of really confused about the timeline where it was set, and not realizing that they probably needed to read Power the Dark Crystal to sort of get to know what's happening beneath, and more about the world and the settings and the characters and all that kind of stuff. So I actually be curious, Peter and Nancy, just your thoughts on that from that story aspect. Yeah.
Well, I'll be brief, as Nancy has more extensive notes. But just in terms of any book, there's always you always have to put in at least a little bit for someone who's never heard of it before, picks it up and wants to read it. And so, whether that's, 3 or 4 paragraphs or a chapter, it depends. For this, I have to say, I have not actually read all of the Power of the Dark Crystal series.
Okay.
So I didn't pick it up at the time it came out. And by the time I started reading it, there was all sorts of mixed reactions. I kind of went, story, as Nancy said, story isn't strong, and that actually hurts me as a writer. So I thought, I probably don't want to just sort of binge it and go, oh, that wasn't what I thought. So I was interested to come at The Power of the Dark Crystal, Beneath the Dark Crystal, without having read the previous. And coming at it that way, I can say that I understood about 80% because the callbacks were subtle, and they didn't rely on The Power of the Dark Crystal, which was great. So it's a group of characters that we're introducing. Here's a story that's interesting, and, go for it. And it made sense to me. I actually liked it quite a lot. But Nancy, what did you have on that?
Well, I actually had an interesting take on this because I read first, too, just like you did. I bought this book first. I didn't know you had to have read Power of the Dark Crystal to actually pick up on these things. I think I actually mentioned to Philip, I was like, I don't get where Jin and Kira went. Do I need to know all this stuff? And I felt like I really wanted to, because they would hint at things that happened. Like, I was like, oh, there's this cool eel dragon creature. Where did it come from? Why is everyone all freaked out about it? And then they were talking about how Jin and Kira were gone, and then Algra's like, not gone, or you're just not here. And I'm like, so did they die? Or, because this is Algra we're talking about here. I'm like, did they die? Are they in a different place? Are they in a different part of Thras? So it's the same thing about, 80% you get if you pick this up without reading Power. And there are still things I don't quite get because they don't seem to line up to me with Power, but there's a lot that I got from reading it. I think they definitely intended you to read Power first. Even when I'm writing my books and things like that, you have to have you either have to be very subtle and tell people what happened in the previous book, or you almost have to have an information dump. And it's better if you're subtle, but sometimes you kind of have to have a combination of the two, because it seems like if people pick up a second book and they haven't read the first, they just don't mesh up well enough. And I
Well,
felt like with
there's
this,
a curiosity and understanding, I think, is
yeah,
what you're saying, Nancy. You want the new
yeah,
reader to be curious about what happened before, but you also want them to understand what's actually going on in this story that's happening. And that's the subtle
exactly.
balance.
Mhm.
And
And
I enjoyed it, but I'm sure I would have got more out of it.
yeah, it's
Yeah.
difficult to do, especially in such a rich setting like the Dark Crystal,
Oh yeah.
because you're building off of people who have seen the movie, who haven't seen the movie, who have read the prequels, haven't read the prequels, may have read this one first and haven't read Power and things like that. So it was a difficult thing to do. I felt like they did a pretty good job of it, but there were
Yeah.
some things that if you've watched the movie and haven't read Power, that were really you really wanted to know what happened to Jin and Kira, because if you watch the movie and you pick this up, you're like, "Oh my God, what happened? Did they die?" And then
Yeah.
you want to pick up Power. So that was interesting for me because I picked it up and I was like, I I feel like I've got where they're going with this story, but I don't know enough. You know, so I actually felt like I had to get Power of the Dark Crystal, which I was
Yeah.
kind of loathing doing, but
Yeah.
I did it and I read it, and
Yeah.
at least I get an idea of where they're coming from now.
Yeah, so I think that was sort of one of the big things where I felt like, yeah, they definitely probably needed sort of a bit of a previously on the Dark Crystal. I know some comics they usually do have little blurbs at the start. I mean, one of the comics I read, of course, is Star Wars, and they always have the crawl at the start of each issue. Because if you think about it, with the comics, they're only coming out every once a month, and sometimes, you know, if you're buying a lot of comics, it's probably hard to sort of keep track of, you know, what's happened in in the previous issue. So I'm really curious. I'm really hoping. I'm be curious if they're going to do that with issue 2, or whether it's just going to, you know, be like. I mean, even Power didn't really have a, you know, description as well. You sort of had to follow through. But that might be just the way the Boom Studio works. I haven't read any of their other comics that do, you know, have like a blurb or that sort of thing. But yeah, I think it was just something that I sort of felt that they needed to work on.
There's one other Boom, to go off what you were saying, Phil. Is one other Boom comic that I'm subscribed to, and it's a whole new world thing. It's not connected to anything else, and so it just starts. But again, it comes out monthly, and issue 2 and 3 that I have, they just pick up directly where you left off. They don't give you that. But you're right. Most, like, I also subscribe to a lot of Marvel ones, and they usually give you, like Nancy was saying, they give you the information dump. Since it's a comic book, you know, you don't have those 3-4 paragraphs to play with. So they just say, oh, here's the scenario, here's the setting, boom, let's go. But yeah, and I think Power could get away with that because you've probably seen the movie if you were a Dark Crystal fan. So Power could get away with that. But yeah, I agree. I think Beneath the Dark Crystal needed to give you at least an information dump.
It's like if you watch anime or something like that, and suddenly, previously, this is what we've seen because it comes out once a week. This is worse because it comes out once a month. So it's like they have to do that information dump, or you might not remember.
See, here's one thing I've been wondering about in general, right? So I'm starting to wonder if this type of stuff we've been talking about with Power and into Beneath, how we don't have a good feel for where we're at or whatnot with story and setting. I'm wondering if the world of the Dark Crystal, right, like throughout the universe, whatever you want to call it, if it just lends itself better to prequel stories than sequel story, right? I don't know. So I think about like Creation Myths and graphic novels, right? They did a really great job with those because they have time, right? You've got to, like Jason was just saying, right? It's hard to do that in a comic, right? Unless you just do like what you were mentioning Marvel does, which they say, here's where you are, go. But like Creation Myths, you know, you've got time because it's not rushed like a comic, right? You've got 90 pages as opposed to 20 or whatever. So I'm starting to wonder if maybe it's even that the world of the Dark Crystal lends itself to prequels more than sequels. What do y'all think about that?
There's also the whole thing of expectation. When you're writing about Jin and Kira, you're writing about heroes from people's childhoods. People are going to expect you to do a really good job, and they'll have something in mind that you didn't necessarily have. it's harder to do something that happens in the future because you're bound to disappoint people. But with prequels, you don't have any of the same characters. You have a lot more liberty. You can make heroes of your own, and it's just, I think that's part of the problem, because when I read the back of this and was like, it made it sound like they were power hungry and stuff like that. I'm like, I just can't see those characters going in that direction after they went through all that. And then it just was more of the same, where it just kind of built up, and I just was, you're bound to have fans that are going to be disappointed. And I actually talked to Joey a little bit about this because he was really worried about doing the prequels. And I'm like, man, everyone's going to have an idea of how they felt the prequel should be. You need to write what's in your heart and what you've, actually studied, and just be true to it, because you're not going to satisfy everyone.
No.
And
yeah, especially after 30 years of waiting, we've already had these ideas stewing in our brains. So deliver them.
Yeah, and everyone who sees the end of that movie, it's left open-ended enough that it's like, what happened at the end, and you can kind of imagine. In my sort of naive way, because I was young when the end of this movie came out, I imagined it being fairly happily ever after. Surely they weren't the last two Gelflings there, so they probably, gathered everyone together, created their civilization again, and everything ended peacefully and nicely. But of course, in reality, when you get older, you realize it's not going to be that easy. But at the same time, I don't know, I was still kind of disappointed in how they portrayed them. One thing, did anyone else ever ask this question? Why didn't they have any children?
I actually asked that question.
Because
I came up with kind of a future story, which I won't go to get into. I may eventually write it. But it's, well, you've only got 2 Gelfling left, and they don't have kids. Where do the rest of the Gelfling come from?
It was almost like they were an Adam and Eve sort of symbol at the end of the movie, like, repopulate the earth. And I'm thinking, what really got to me about the end of the Power series was the fact that it was like, they didn't have an heir. And I'm like, why don't they have an heir? Why haven't they been trying to portray the vision of the peace that they wanted to draw to a child of their own, unless they just couldn't have children, because they're clearly in love. They're still talking to each other in each other's minds the whole time.
With the sequel idea, it's in terms of a fixed point. Here's the point where everybody goes, Dark Crystal ended. Great. So that's the peak of action. The Urskeks, are gone, and Thraz back to, the original owners, if you will. So we can only go down from here, or do we kind of shift direction? So as Fish was saying, prequels are easier because they've always got that fixed point to go up to. But an interesting example would be Batman Beyond. So you had a new future series, that's been nothing like before, but builds on the previous. And it built it extremely well. And interesting characters, new dynamics, new relationships. So that's what you want to bring in a property or story, what have you, that's well established. It's here's what went before, but building from that, we have something fascinating and new, but still retains some of the character of that. So there's a good bridge between the two.
The whole Jin and Kira relationship is very much kind of mirrored by the whole Kincho and Therma relationship too. So it's like they're kind of bringing back that dynamic in a different story, which I thought they did very well. That was in my little page of things they did well. Also,
see to me that
video, like if Philip wants us to do this on video, I'm going to take full advantage of this.
Go ahead.
I just met you. Let's fall in love and rule the planet.
Right.
I mean, that's like the Therma Kincho relationship for me. Like, so that's what I wrote in some of my notes. Is like, but it's like a faded echo of Jen and Kira. It's to me, it's like, and I don't want to be too pessimistic. But I feel like that's a little bit like lazy writing, right? It's like, I don't know if y'all watched the series The Office, the American version, where they had Jim and Pam, and then they had Andy and whatever her name was, Aaron. And they ended up breaking that up because they're like, all right, we've already done the salesman and the receptionist, all right? Let's take it a different direction. And I feel like, what are we doing here? I mean, this is moving different direction to a degree because of different characters and they have different stories. but it just feels a little bit. And I think that's my problem overall with these comics in general that I've read is like, and I'm trying to give grace to writers because God knows it takes a lot of talent to do what they do, man. But like, I think it's hard to find that tone, right? To find the right tone for the Dark Crystal. Like, I think you got a visionary like Jim Henson and Brian Froud that came together and created a magical baby. And I just think it's hard to do that ever again. So you take, like, I think saying earlier, we've been waiting on this for 30 years, so our expectations are pretty high. I don't think it can ever be that.
Think about this. That's just the thing. And this happens in movies and things like this all the time. I'm 36. So I watched this when I was growing up. And what they're trying to do is they evoke that nostalgia by putting a relationship like that in there. I mean, it makes sense when you think about it. They want new people. So they put in the romantic relationship. They try and make it as close to what we saw when we were growing up as they can to get us into it again. And that's kind of what they've done that with Star Wars. Think about the new Star Wars movies and how, like, the new one from Disney was just like, the first one that we saw when we were kids. But there's a reason for that. And I feel like they kind of did a little better with Beneath, because it was like with Power, they did that. They set us up for it. Now they're doing something new, which I liked. I thought that it was kind of gimmicky that they brought the Skeksis and the Uru back. I just felt like I was like, this is a really interesting story. I know what you're doing here because, I got a degree in media arts. I know what you're doing here, but I don't like it. I was like, because it just was like they could have, if you think about it, the Skeksis were in a cage through most of the first part of that story. They didn't even have to be there. None of that had to be there, and it still would have been a compelling story.
So this is what I'm interested in Jason's. Like, Jason's take, like, you seem, just from the little I've heard you talk and I've read your stuff and seen your videos, you seem to have a little bit different angle on it, right? Like, of positivity, and like you seem to enjoy it. You seem to be enjoying it more than I do, and it makes me very angry. So tell me, tell me what it is that you really enjoy these. Like, what is it you enjoy most about these comics you've read so far, man?
Overall, the main thing is just getting more Dark Crystal. So, it's like when your son draws you a picture and you're like, well, it's not the best art, but you're my son and I love you, so it's affectionate to you. And it's that nostalgia thing. I do think you're right though. I have greatly enjoyed the prequel stuff, greatly, and I think some of that, going back to story, is because when they did, if you remember when, I believe it was Lisa Henson at a Comic-Con, maybe it was 2012 or 2013, when they had announced the author quest. Actually, we did
a meeting amongst ourselves, it was last year actually, and we invited Archaea, we invited Brian Froud, we invited everybody that we knew inside the company that was involved with any aspect of Dark Crystal and licensing, merchandising, publishing, development. Hallie Stanford, who's sitting over there, does our TV development. She and all of her folks came. So we called that meeting the Great Conjunction. And we kind of overwhelmed Brian Froud with so many questions. We actually had a couple guys there who may be here, I don't know, but they were scribes. They like wrote notes on every single thing that we learned, and they asked questions, and they unearthed mythological points that some of us didn't ever realize. Like, they interpreted for us the Wall of Destiny, which we will talk to you about. And out of that, we wrote up the franchise Bible, which is something that a lot of companies do, creative companies. And out of that, we said, this is fascinating. We want to put this out there. We want to develop the world more.
Actually, and they had said that they sat down and they had a meeting called the Great Conjunction, and Brian Froud was there, and all these other guys, all the other think head tanks of the Dark Crystal, and they mapped out a lot of stuff, and that's when we saw the website. A lot of stuff was mapped out. They filled in gaps. They put in major events, and so prequel stuff. You have a lot to play. You have already not a very tight template, but enough to where you stick with it. With the newer stuff, it's kind of whatever. Um, and I mean, Power, there is still a lot of mystery because Power of the Dark Crystal starts like 100 years after. So when the Earthquakes say, make Thrawn your light, creating your own light, like, ooh, wow, what's it going to be like? And I thought too, like you said, Nancy, like an Adam and Eve type thing and a new beginning and this and that. But we don't know too much what happens because when we see them, they're sleeping. They're in some kind of like comatose, gelfling, who knows what fast, some kind of new thing. But I have enjoyed the new characters. I really have enjoyed. I do like Kensho.
Yeah.
He's kind of like your Captain America type guy, where he lives by principle and he's going to do the right thing, even if it's against the whole Gelfling society. I think they did go bad because there were corrupt people who didn't experience what Jen and Kira did, and they were sleeping, and apparently that didn't get passed down. Yeah, I wonder too. It would be a great twist if the heirs of Jen and Kira show up, if there are some. I think that'd be a great twist.
Because, yeah, and beneath an heir just suddenly shows up from one of the other queens, and that's like, I just thought it just didn't make sense to me because they were so in love. I'm like, did they lose their children? Did they just not have the way to have it after Kira was hurt?
Well,
just
hopefully it answered.
Yeah, well, hopefully just like one line would have been enough. It just that didn't make sense to me. But I love Kensho. Kensho, honestly, even though I know that Thermo is cool and everything, I felt like he should have been the main character. But that was just my opinion.
Well, so can somebody educate me on this? So I'm not a big comic book guy, right? Like I never buy one comic book ever, and now I have bought 2 series, right? Because of the Dark Crystal. So is this? And I've seen some comments on our Facebook group or whatnot, and I'm genuinely curious, like about the art, right? Like, is this generally how comic book art looks? Is this lazy art, artistry or not? Like, or is this kind of like, okay, that works? Who has experience with comic books?
There's a wide variety of the types of art. Like comic books now, I this is what I usually tell my friends when they're going down to the comic book store with me. It's like going to a library. Whatever kind of genre of book you want to find, you're going to find that now in comic books. It's not just superheroes. It's not just fantasy. You could find sci-fi. You could find there's storyteller stuff. There's they actually do historical stuff now in comic books too. So there is a really wide variety. I do think this art is on the higher scale of good art actually in comic books. It's not the top tier best stuff, but you see that kind of stuff in like the newest Spider-Man, the newest Avengers, the ones that they have, they're rolling in the dough. They can afford the top-notch artists and whatnot.
And like for me, with art, like I've been pretty happy with the art with Beneath the Dark Crystal, and like there's been so many like other comics, like even with the Star Wars, you probably know Jason, but some of the Star Wars issues where they just seem like they just like Photoshop like the characters' faces from the film and sort of try and make them like ultra realistic and don't have.
I do not like those.
Yeah, neither do I. So yeah, but yeah, just
I can speak to it just a little bit.
Yeah, totally.
About my own experience. I'm not a big comic book buyer, but if I see something I like, I'll collect that series. I just recently collected the Star Trek Next Generation Broken Mirror series, and the story is solid. The art kind of hit and miss. They didn't go for ultra realistic, but most of the accurate details are there. What I like about Beneath the Dark Crystal is it's clean. So it's colorful, it's clean, it tells the story, it doesn't get in the way. And I've seen some amazing comics, like the Sandman series, Gaiman. It's just gorgeous to look at. And, oh, hey, there's some story there. I got lost in the art. But it's not, so intricate that you're like, what's going on? Where's the characters? Yes, thank you.
I felt like Power. I felt like Power of the Dark Crystal. They did a great job with like the backgrounds and a lot of the artwork.
Yeah,
because
the color is so vibrant, right?
Beautiful,
beautiful colors. You can see little creatures and things like that, and they put so much detail into the whole background. But when you actually see the characters, they're very simplistic, which I thought. I don't know. In some scenes, that kind of made sense, and in others, I felt like it detracted.
Yeah,
But
I
it
agree.
was
Like with
yeah.
Gelfling and Podlings, like they're pretty simple. But like
Mhm.
Skeksis and Uru, like
Oh
you want
God.
those details.
Yeah, and the Skeksis had like no detail at all, and that bothered me because I was like, even though they're technically, I guess they're more sharp edges and things like that, they did have lines and things on their beaks, and they didn't put that here. I couldn't differentiate between one Skeksis and another except for through the dialogue.
Yeah, and
That
style
yeah, they did
does
a much
part
better
of the
job at
storytelling in comics. And
hmm
yeah, the Skeksis did look a little too cute in that last series for sure.
Well, it was like they were just too simplistic. They were, like I said, they struck me as scenery eating, and it might have partly been the art style. The one of the things about Beneath that I really like is you can really see the expressions on the characters' faces. They put little details. They put maybe like a teardrop that hasn't fallen yet on the corner of the eye, stuff like that. It might be a small thing, but with comics, it does make a difference. It helps you feel the expression.
It's part of your
So,
storytelling since you have a lot less words on the page.
Even as I'm looking at it now and I'm seeing it, and this is besides the art, forgive me, but just looking at the story and all this, I was just thinking to ask everybody a question, like, because I was sitting there asking myself, I was like, what happened in this episode, right? What happened in book one, really? I was sitting there asking myself, like, what did I read? What did I remember? And I think, and I was just looking at the last page, where it's like, in what I'm calling its Black Panther moment, where someone comes to challenge the throne, and
yeah.
I'm thinking like, I'm thinking maybe this whole first episode is that reminder of power. You know what I mean? Maybe they spent the whole time
Yes.
reminding you, and now the last 2 pages are like, want to go save the world? Hey, I want to be emperor too. Like,
Thank,
Bum, bum,
thank you.
Bum, bum,
Thank
right.
you, Fish. That is exactly how I feel.
Okay.
Because I read this and I remember I wrote to Philip being like, can we do an entire podcast on this? Because I felt like it was kind of a flashback to power. Like this was
was a
the
bit, yeah.
opening thing where it was like, okay, this is what happened last time, now go. I'm actually kind of excited about the next one though, because it set me up.
Yep.
It built up an expectation because, like I said, the art style is nice. I like the fact that characters are portrayed as have more of a portrayal of being more mature, and I like the fact that it sets it up for all that stuff going down. Like, even though I kind of get an idea of what Kinsho is trying to do, I'm not 100%. I think he's trying to send the girl to basically trade in all this treasure, which is useless to the Gelflings at this point, to go get seed, to go and get the supplies that they need to rebuild. But it doesn't explicitly say that. So it's like it's setting all this stuff up. There's a challenge for the throne. He doesn't want to be a leader, but he wants to do something. He might even be going with her, and I'm not even sure. But I kind of like that because it's like they took Beneath to take this and say, okay, all these people who didn't read Power, here's what's going on, and then at the end it's like, now go.
Yeah.
So that's kind of exciting to me.
Sorry, just going to say exactly what Nancy said. It made me curious. So I'm happy with the setup, and these people seem interesting, and something happened before that has informed us to where we're going to go now, and when's issue 2 coming out? But that's long and the short of it.
Yeah, and I think it was sort of their attempt to really try to build up what's happened in the past, because I mean we didn't sort of get the blurb or sort of description for new readers. And like I thought, Beneath, the first issue was sort of like just a good sort of almost a bit of a reintroduction in a ways, which I kind of liked. And I know, we got introduced to Tula, a Gelfling character who's has some similarities with Kensho, how she worked in the stables and that Kensho did at one point, and she's interested in being a guard, and that's what he was before. So they have quite a bit in common, and I know with things, sort of speculating whether there's a potential love triangle between Tula and.
I hope not.
Yeah.
I got the very small potential love entanglement because of just this picture right, if you can see it up there.
Uh-huh.
Yeah, it's like she's very close to him, and she's like, Kensho, you saved this world, both worlds. If you think the Gelfling should be doing something, speak up. And I'm just like, because it's the classic love triangle. Because the entire first part, Therma's sitting here thinking about him and talking about how, gosh, I wish we could be, I was thinking about you and thinking about how nice it would be if we could be in the same world, and then I forced myself to stop, and then it's like, meanwhile, you haven't actually seen him thinking about her. And then suddenly this other character comes up, and I'm like, oh, don't do this to me too. I felt like it feels like a forced thing, which is why I don't like it.
Okay.
There's honestly, and when you look at this, all the prequels and things are YA, and the trend in YA is to put a love triangle in there, even if you don't necessarily want it. I'm guilty of this too. There's almost a love triangle in my Blood Rain series because, and this sounds bad, but it's what's expected of you. You're supposed to do it, whether you want to do it or not, and it just kind of. Hopefully, it's not going to become a big part of Beneath the Dark Crystal. I guess we'll wait and see.
When they released,
not to rant too much. Being an author in this position, it just.
When they released the preview of Beneath the Dark Crystal, and that you could see like 4 pages or 6 pages. I initially thought that too. I was like, oh, here's this girl, and she looks like she has googly eyes, and she's just like, wow, gawking at Kensho. But then after I finished the first issue, I think Kensho, because Kensho, they do have that kind of text message type thing through the crystal. That that's what I call it. I don't know what it is technically yet. So they're in communication, and they had to. He the greater good of right now is to put a hold on that relationship. Hopefully he just puts a hold on it and doesn't just reject her for this new, whatever googly-eyed fangirl, Tula. And he realizes, no, I need to save the world right now. I need to do what I can for Thra. And she realizes, like, I need to do what I can for Mithra. So I think, and because, like I said, I think he's like the Captain America type. He lives by conviction and whatnot. Like, I think he'll stay true to that. And this girl's just like, oh, she wants to help? Cool, come help. And I hope. I'm going to call it now, though. Issue 1. There's going to be no love triangle, and he's sticking with his Therma girl.
Yeah.
Okay.
I got to call something. I don't have any other issues, so.
Yeah.
In the Dark Crystal manga, there's like a scene where basically, it's established a male-female relationship at the beginning, and then there's this girl who's there, and it's like, oh, so brave, and he calls the love interest over to the table, and I'm like, and you actually see her with this angry look on her face, and the next panel, the rejected one that was, trying to kind of muscle in.
Yeah.
Here's one thing I'm thinking too with what was the girl's name? Tula? Was that the
Yes, and
the other girl?
Tula the fangirl, or Tula the
third wheel. Get out of here, Tula. No. So I'm thinking maybe. So now that I'm looking at it again, and I'm trying to give it more of a chance in my mind, I'm thinking maybe even Kensho's looking at her and feeling like comfort, because I think there's a lot of weight on his shoulders, right? People are coming to him saying, so, Kensho, Lightborn, when you talk to the Earthskeks, what do we do now? And I think that he sees her, and they go back and forth. She's like, oh, I've worked in the barn, in the kitchen. He's like, oh, yeah, me too. I used to have it easy like that too. And maybe now I've got some solace in somebody else, who reminds me of what my innocence used to be. So maybe, I don't know. Peter, did you get any of that, or what do you think, man?
I got a sense of purpose from the characters. I think everything else kind of falls beside that in terms of the way we've given set up, especially, with the Queen challenge as well. So I think Kensho is more purposeful than most, so I don't think he's going to let himself, if you will, and forgive me the word, distract himself with an interest. So I think that's going to be a driving force in the comic there.
Yeah, and I do think that she was one of the few that was willing to actually do something, which he picked up on. Everybody else was complaining, and she was the only one who actually didn't complain to him, which is why he's like, hey, do you want to save the world?
Yeah.
Here's what you can do at the end.
Right.
Yeah, because I mean, yeah, he really wants nothing to do with the Gelflings, and he's sort of, I think he mentioned about how it's like been, Jen and Kira took over for 100 years, and look how it all ended up, and ruling for 100 years, like what difference is it going to make? So yeah, I am really curious about what's going to happen. Yeah, go ahead.
Oh, this face right there.
Yeah,
they say Kencho, a savior.
Yeah.
And her eyes, dude, she's so fangirling right there.
Yeah,
and he's like,
yeah,
yes, a savior. Yes.
That was actually a fun moment when Olga sort of decides that Kensho would be the leader of the Gelflings, and yeah, he's just like shell shocked. He's like, I don't want to do this. And which I guess that's why he sort of runs away and yeah.
It's one of those things. It's like, yes, the crystal has decided Kensho will be the leader, and he's just like, Olga, why did you do this to me?
It's like Willow. The bones have spoken.
Yeah.
Well, if you ever...
Dad, forget the bird.
Yeah.
Go in the direction of the bird.
Exactly. Like,
But with the Gelfling acting like children, Agra's the mother, and then Kensho's the older brother. And it's just, well, I'm sorry, you're halfway there. That's better than anybody else around, so you've got the job. Everybody else took one step back, and
Which is pretty
nobody
interesting.
gainsays Agra.
Yeah, and it's interesting because you wonder how much of the history the Gelfling have of their time before the Dark Crystal movie, because they were, a matriarchal society. There were 7, Gelfling clans and things like that. And they do mention some of the clans, but they don't seem to be the same as they were in the prequel era. So, you wonder how much, and their history we know is, usually songs and storytelling. So it's not like they have Xerox copies of stuff. So they have a, really precise history anyways.
Yeah.
So it makes you wonder, like, do they know how they used to be ruled and what Agra's role was? And,
Thank you for bringing that up. I didn't understand why they kept saying the Urskeks tell you. Because I was like, I was under the impression through all the other books that the Urskeks basically were a long time ago. They taught the Gelflings things. And then that the Skeksis just kind of warped that and basically acted like the Urskeks weren't a thing. So it's like they know they don't want to be under Skeksis' rule. Maybe they're just reaching for straws here and saying, what did the Urskeks say? But I felt like that kind of was out of nowhere too, because I was like, it feels like to me they'd be more upset that Jen and Kira left, which I also didn't understand, but that goes into a whole nother, well, no, it doesn't. It goes into here. Did you notice that Jen and Kira looked younger when they left? And I don't know why they left, because they went to like the Urskek planet. Because if we've established in previous books that the Dark Crystal is a warp point between worlds, I never understood why they left to go to the other world in the first place, especially because by the end panel of Power of the Dark Crystal, they look young again. And they actually mention in Beneath the Dark Crystal, this put some things, kind of tied some things together for me. They were saying how bathe yourself in the light. You can, rule for a whole century. It sounds like Kira and Jen did sort of what the Skeksis did and used the light of the Dark Crystal to prolong their lifetime. So it's one of these things where it's like, now granted, the Dark Crystal was not dark at this point, so it wasn't making them evil, but it did prolong their lives. So they ruled for at least a century. But it was one of those things I was like, none of these people would have heard even stories of the Urskeks at this point. That was like when they first were becoming an evolved race. They were part, the Urskeks were teaching them how to farm and stuff like that. That's why I didn't get in this book. They're like, what did the Urskeks say? I'm like, why would you even think to ask that? Because to you, they were just aliens and they disappeared like right after they appeared.
That's the kind of stuff that in these series, I didn't mean to cut you off, I'm sorry if I did, but like, it just reminded me, like, that's the kind of stuff that gives me pause. You know what I mean? Like as a reader and a lover of this world, where I'm just like, okay, yeah, Urskeks, yep, we love them. We all love them, right? Yes, we do. We love Urskeks. Like, we get it. They were there. Agra was there. Skeksis and Uru existed. We got it. What's next? Like, so it's like when I see that stuff, when they keep doing these callbacks, they're like, oh, remember when the Urskeks were around now? Everybody remember the Urskeks?
like,
Yeah. It's that
no
because
one
it's like,
remembers
dear
the
God.
Urskeks.
Right.
Yeah. And
It's like clearly for the reader, not the characters.
This
At
probably
best-
seems like a nitpicky thing too,
Yeah.
because I had to really immerse myself in this universe to write that story for the prequels. So it's one of those things that, thinking back on all the research I did and stuff, I think about these things, and sometimes I probably think a little too much. Someone who's picking this up for the first time might not think. They might think, oh well, the Urskeks looks really regal and whatnot. I'm sure that they would know what to do. But thinking back on the history, back in the day, that's what the Gelfling did. But at this point, this is so many generations removed, I just didn't understand it. But that was just me.
Yeah, at best, the only thing I can think of is, and this is just kind of how I feel it in my head, is at some point, because Jen and Kara weren't always asleep. You know, like, it seems like they would get up every now and then, and people really looked up to them. You know, they're kind of the Adam and Eve. You know, they're kind of the creators of everyone else, or the ruler, or they were the rulers. So perhaps there were times they, you know, because their only experience with the Urskeks were, oh, you know, you just brought Kira back to life, and you gave us the power of, like, you made everything green and good again. You know, and you know, it's all good now. So kind of like the Gelfling in the creation myths, where, you know, they see him for a little bit of time, and they see, you know, really just their best side, and they start kind of worshiping them, basically, you know, starting kind of a little cult type thing or whatever. You know, perhaps maybe that's all they know of them, and they saw them, you know, take their rulers and make things right again. So I don't know. That's the best I could kind of think of.
I think this is kind of part of my struggle with some of these books. Like, I think about my last note on this really is like, that I wrote about this is, I feel like the writers are just painfully aware that I'm here reading it. You know, that's one thing, like J.M. Lee's books so far, like, they've not been like, oh, the greatest novel of all time. But like, I really think that dude does not care what I think, right? Which is really what you want, right? Like, and I don't care that he doesn't care, right? Like, he needs to not care. It's like, as a real artist, you have to be true to what's in there, right? Whether I'm sitting here being like, ridiculous or not, or being like, amazing. It doesn't matter what I think. Like, he's got the story in him, and he's got to get it out as pure as he can, right? But these things, these comics so far, I just keep feeling like I'm watching like bad acting, right? Like, it's like the actors keep glancing at the camera, you know, and I'm just like, you are in a film, right? Like, what? It's like what it makes me feel like.
Yeah. There's a good analogy for that, Fish. So it's that same house has been in the neighborhood for 30 years. You know, they painted the outside again. They put an addition on. You know, they paved the driveway. They changed landscaping. It's still the same house. But if you really want something interesting, you demolish the house. Or it's the same neighborhood. You build a new house. You know, the same people are in the same neighborhood. You recognize the landscape. You know, you're kind of familiar with it. But it's something new. I mean, you can't just go to the house, walk in, and go, hey, look, they put a new coat of paint in all the rooms and changed the furniture. Great. You know, it's, and you have to also, as a writer, make sure you get all the details right. You know where you've come from. And if you need it, you can call back to it, and it's consistent. So you have, you know, on the one hand, okay, well, they've done their research and they know what they're talking about for the new story. On the other hand, it's a new story. These are new characters. This is something new created. And if you're trying to walk that fine line between the two, the story ends up being about that big. So there's no room to really do anything with it.
Yeah, and I want to be on record as saying, "There, but for the grace of God, go I." Right? I don't want to. I don't want to have to carry the mantle. Right? I guess that's too much. Right? Because you got people like idiots like me out here being like, "That's not correct at all." Like it. You know. So I don't want to have to deal with those people. You know.
I know, and being a writer, I'm very conscious of it. I am not God's gift to writing. I know I've made mistakes, and it's one of these things, though, that it's like people like J.M. Lee. He agonizes over trying to get the details right. But I kind of know him, so I know that he does. Like, he was talking about on Facebook one time about how he's trying to figure out how astronomy works when you have triple suns and stuff like this.
Yeah,
I mean, this is serious attention to detail. And I respect that, and that comes through the writing. What bothered me about this book is it's like, I know what they were trying to do with, kind of bringing back the old villains kind of thing, and you're trying to almost set up for Beneath the whole time with power is what I felt like. But we didn't need the Skeksis and the Uru back. It would have been just as good a story without them. The whole thing with the cracking the crystal and it becoming dark and then suddenly Skeksis pour out. I'm like, I thought the Urskeks went back to their planet. There's no reason for this to happen on their planet because even though they're connected, they're not connected to that point that suddenly they turn separate. And also, they said the Uru were still there. And I'm like, no, not at the end of the film, they weren't. And I tried. It's one of those things I'm like, suspension of disbelief. This is a different thing. I almost feel like it's a Marvel alternate universe, is what I feel like. And when I try to read it from that perspective, I'm a little better. But I think that Beneath has a lot of potential because of the fact that it's like it's set up for Beneath, but Beneath could be something a little bit different. I don't think there are going to be any Uru or Skeksis in Beneath, which is why I get excited about it. And that's why I liked reading the first one. Yes, something new and different, kind of.
Yes, yeah.
That separates from the main kind of remaking of the plot.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be really interesting to know as we go through, Beneath, what will be sort of the big threat, or the antagonist of the story. And I mean, we sort of got that a little bit towards the end when Nita. So basically, of course, we've got Kensho and Tula. They're sort of gone off, and they're sort of as Ethan. I'll just quote what Ethan wrote, as a humanitarian mission. To sort of go off with the Dragon Beast, and then we get to Therma and Mithra, and they're basically going to crown her as the Ember Queen. And I know that originally they would have 3 queens that sort of took over Mithra, but because there's only Therma, who's a queen, and then Fiola is working in the council. Well, she is an Ember Queen, but she decided to work in the council. And then this third character actually just popped up at the end, just as Therma was about to be crowned, and Nita sort of pops up and says that that she's the sole heir of Chal and Salura, and which is really interesting, sort of setting things up between Nita and Therma. But what's interesting now, it's like, well, you actually got 3 Ember Queens, all together now. It's like, instead of having the fighting that they're probably going to have, you could just have them 3 sort of, working together,
It would be nice.
Yeah.
Too much.
I thought about that at that final scene, which was the big conflict, the big like surprise last thing. I was like, oh, well, now you have the 3.
Yeah.
Can't they just be homies? And
that's gonna be the first page of the next episode. Oh, 1, 2. Oh, we're good. Never mind.
Yeah.
That'd be awesome. Yeah.
If they wanted to stick to tradition,
Hey.
yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah,
But they have been saying things like things need to change.
Yeah, true. Yeah.
They drew her as the villain, though.
Yeah.
That's just the thing. I mean, okay, I've got to say this nicely. She has a very witchy face.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
And actually, one of my observations, if you looked at the first,
witch face.
and actually, when I was rereading Beneath last night, the first couple of pages, when you see the filings, you actually see Nita in the first panel because she's actually like flying off somewhere, which was sort of like a kind of cool thing. I didn't notice it till I reread it the second or third time, which was kind of cool. And I know also I think you probably noticed, Jason, or maybe Fisher, or any of you guys, that they've actually misnamed on the heirs of the filings. So in Beneath, it's challenged Salura, with Salura, but in Power of the Dark Crystal, it's Saluna. So I've just noticed, that unfortunately there's been a misspelling with Saluna or Salura, and I'd be very curious if that's going to be fixed up, or whether it's actually
Or
a different
was there?
character.
Or was it a mistake?
Yeah.
That actually happened to me, Fish. I was like, is it the same character, or was there another story there? And then I was like, I'm probably reading too much into this, or maybe I just imagined the other spelling or something.
I mean, but you all as writers, like, aren't you writing for like the nerds like me of the world who'll be like, this is unbelievable. I can't believe is it a spelling? I mean, aren't you concerned about or aware that I'm out there being a moron somewhere in the world? Like,
I don't have a very large fan base, unfortunately, yet, but it does come to my mind because every now and again I'm going to write something that's going to be wrong, like especially because in my Blood Rain series there's a very complex universe and a complex magic system, and I'm bound to get something wrong eventually. And it's one of those things. I was actually talking out with my husband and I was like, what I'm going to have to do is if someone calls me out and tries to come up with a good explanation why this would happen, I'm going to be like, yes, that's very astute. Yes, that's exactly what I was going for.
I meant to do that. Yes.
That's right. Yeah.
We're writers. We don't I mean, we know our universe better than other people do. We even know our inspiration for our universe, but that doesn't mean occasionally we don't make a mistake.
Yes, yeah.
I think probably with this one, it was just a spelling error. I mean,
I think so.
Who does Power and who does Beneath? It looks like
they're different authors.
Yeah,
the
different
author was Adam Smith of Beneath Dark Crystal.
Yeah.
And then Simon Spurrier and Philip Kennedy Johnson did Power.
Yeah.
When things change hands, there's bound to be a mistake or two. I'm hoping that's just a spelling error, and either they'll correct it or they'll just own it and just keep going that way. And
the smooth way to do that is to say, like, this is the way that the Firelings pronounce it. The other way is the way they don't. Right. Like in Texas, we say Ethernet.
Exactly.
Get away with that.
Ethernet or something weird like that.
Yeah.
But that's
when you are writing.
Right, but to go back to what Fish is asking about, why I like these things and why. Yes, I'm not a writer, but I'm a consumer, big heavy consumer. And so when it comes to comic books, I usually have the more grace because it's fast. It's more fast action. It's more there's less words. So I'm usually a little more lenient on that's not quite canon. Okay, you called all those things ages. Well, those aren't technically ages. So I just kind of assume like they're probably just talking about time periods. I'm not going to go too technical with that.
Yeah.
I want to though. I want to, trust me.
Yeah.
But I usually break from that. But when you get some more novel stuff, even junior novels, I do expect, because you have more time, you have those 3-4 paragraphs for the rehash this, and I do expect more of that. And thankfully, I think Jan Lee has delivered that.
Yeah, and as a writer, I want to be internally consistent. So, for example, in my second draft of my first novel, I realized I had a pair of characters in two places at the same time. So, caught that in a draft before it gets out. That's very important. So when you are creating something, it has to be internally consistent. And if it's consistent with the previous canon, that also is just as important. But this is why you have a team that, copy editors, line editors, who are going over this. It's why, in television they have, grips who make sure that, the coffee cup is on that table in the scene where it was before. And if there is a mistake, you own up to it and go, well, the next version won't have it. But hopefully those are few and far between so that people can go, oh, they're human. Great. The story was fantastic.
Just make special editions of the movie.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's what I said on one of my.
I'm kidding.
Star Wars jokes. See, that's what I said on my Facebook rant. I said, look, we're a group of people. We are a group of people who, if you put a sock on our hand and go like this, we go, it's alive. So I don't think we're that concerned with like art. At the end of the day, I'm gonna be like, that's whatever. Spelling mistakes, that's whatever. Like, I'm a story guy, right? Like, you give me plot, you show me what happens from a character to point A to point B, and I'm in. You know what I'm saying? So like I said, I'm never, that stuff's never make or break for me. But the canon I have probably hold a little bit more near and dear to my heart, just because I've turned into it's the only thing I collect and really am consumed with on some level. Is the Dark Crystal. So I think I probably give it an unfair chance sometimes. But this talk's been good. I feel a little more hopeful. I feel lighter.
Yeah.
I don't know. maybe we're headed in a good direction.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think maybe with that, we can wrap up our discussion of Beneath the Dark Crystal issue 1. I guess we might as well go for everyone one more time of just our final thoughts on issue 1, and then we'll find out how we can all find you guys online. So I might start with yourself, Nancy. Just your final words on Beneath the Dark Crystal issue 1.
I'm very much looking forward to seeing where it goes with issue 2. I think it was kind of a wrap up of, for those who hadn't read Power of the Dark Crystal, I think it was sufficient in kind of wrapping that up, getting you in the universe, and I think that it's going to be a good series, and I'm looking forward to seeing what direction they take with it.
Cool. And yourself, Jason?
Like I had previously said in my review, not too much was revealed, and so they did make me very curious, very, very curious. And, I do hope that the only time we see Skeksis and Uru are on these awesome David Peterson variant covers. That's the only time I want to see them, because, man, so good. But besides that, there's a lot of curiosity. I'm not really sure where it's going, but I am very hopeful.
Cool, excellent. And yourself, Fish?
Yeah, I think, it's like hopeful with a question mark. Hopeful? I don't want to be too cringy when I think about these things, man. But like I said, this is probably one of the nearest and dearest things in my heart. So I'm hopeful. I'm going to continue to try to give it a fair shot and try to be as open-minded as I can. So I think that I'm hopeful as well that these characters are only on the cover also. So we'll see how it plays out, because I'm interested in seeing something new and seeing where it goes.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, and yourself, Peter. Final words on Beneath the Dark Crystal.
I'm excited. I really liked what was put in front of me, and I went page to page, and I went right through the whole thing. Not once did I go, oh, should I find out about this? Or, maybe I should read The Power of the Dark. Nope. Story had me from the get-go, and I was curious by the end. I was excited, as I said. So I think that, just having this wonderful, wonderful art that's not calling back to the original Dark Crystal, but taking a cleaner direction, as I said, is exactly where it needs to go. So issue 2, like everybody says, bring it on.
Yeah, absolutely. And as for myself with final words, like I enjoyed issue 1 overall. I thought it was a good I think I probably mentioned it earlier, sort of a good reintroduction to the Dark Crystal. And I'm very interested to find out what happens next with issue 2 and what happens beyond, and what for me is like what's going to be the threat for Thra and potentially Mithra as well. So it's all a bit political, I guess, amongst the Gelflings and amongst the Firelings as well, of what to do next. So we've got there's 12 issues for this series that's happening. So we've got 11 more to go. So it's really exciting that we're getting so much more Dark Crystal, and at least sort of this comic is sort of gonna keep us distracted while we're still waiting for Age of Resistance stuff to pop up. And of course with James Lee's book coming later this year in December, so we have got so much to look forward to. And so without further ado, I just want to say thank you so much for watching or listening to The Gathering Songs, episode 21, and hope you stay tuned for the next episode. So go one more time, Nancy. How can the listeners or viewers find more about your work?
Well, I've got nancygray.blogspot.com, which is my blog, basically. Be on the lookout around August 31st. I have the first installment of my series Spine Chillers coming out on Amazon. It's for pre-order right now, Spine Chillers Scarecrow. It's a mid-grade horror series. And you can find me at Facebook. That's writer Nancy Gray, but Nancy Gray is my pen name. Look for me under that and you'll find me. I'm doing mid-grade horror, doing mid-grade fantasy, and I have a completed young adult fantasy trilogy that starts with Blood Rain. Yeah. And you can find that on Amazon too if you like Treehouse Villages and heroic females going on a quest to defeat a big bad, basically.
Yeah. Excellent. And of
I
course,
play a lot of fantasy RPGs.
thank you so much, Nancy. And Jason, how can people find with your YouTube videos for the Dark Crystal Conjunction?
youtube.com/The Dark Crystal Conjunction. I do try to put out a new video once a week. Sometimes I do 2 a week. That's pretty rare.
Yes,
I've been slacking these last couple of weeks, but that's
good, man.
normally the schedule I try to go for. I also am on, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram on Dark Crystal CONJ, because conjunction was too long. But a lot of people ask questions there. I always talk back to people. You can find me on Facebook. I'm in the Dream Fasting group. I'd love to talk all things Dark Crystal. So please drop by again.
And also, I guess for any of the listeners or viewers, Dream Fasting, the Dark Crystal Experience, it's a Facebook group that you can just check out. I think if you go on Facebook and if you just do a search for Dream Fasting, you should be able to find it in the top search results to become a part of the group. And there's so much Dark Crystal discussion that occurs on that group on a daily basis, which is really exciting. And so with yourself, Fish, how can viewers or listeners find you on the internet?
Sure. So I don't do a lot of Dark Crystal creative stuff. I'm a singer and I write lyrics. So if you're interested, you can always check me out at facebook.com/FishRocksMusic, because that's what I do. No, I'm just kidding. Or if you hit me up on Facebook, like I said, I'm in the Dream Fasting group as well. Always looking to talk with fellow Dream Fasters.
Excellent. And last but not least, Peter, how can people find more about your work and your novels that you've been working on with the Dwim Saga?
You can just go to my website. It's www.dwimsaga.com. That's DWIIMM-saga.com. And I update it the 13th of every month and give you an idea of what's going on, where I'm going with that. That's always the best way to contact me. And my email is also on the site. And I also hang out in Dream Fasting quite a lot, although I have taken a step back from social media for the rest of the year so I can work on writing my books.
Yep, no, fair enough. And as always, it's always great to have you on the show. And again, just want to say thank you, everyone, Nancy, Jason, Fish, and Peter. Thank you so much for participating in this first Roundtable YouTube video for Beneath the Dark Crystal Issue 1.
Thank you for putting it on.
That's all right, Nance.
Absolutely.
You're the real hero here, Philip.
Totally.
Thank you so much. All right, that's all. So stay tuned for the next episode and take care. Goodbye.
Take care.
Nice to see everybody.
See y'all. Thanks.
Bye.
You've already taken too long, Gelfling. Hurry!
At last, the crystal calls. It is time to return to the castle.
The crystal calls! To the crystal chamber!
So that's all the time that we have for this episode of Trial by Stone. If you'd like to get in contact with us, you can do so at darkcrystalpodcast@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook at facebook.com/darkcrystalpodcast. We're also on Twitter at darkcrystalpod. We're also on Instagram at darkcrystalpodcast. If you enjoyed the show and think that others will love it too, please write a review on iTunes or on Facebook as well. I'll greatly appreciate that. And if you're watching this on YouTube, hit the like button and subscribe. Thank you all so much, and come back next time for more Trial by Stone.